Hello, Amber.
Hello.
How are you doing?
You know what? I am doing well. I'm busy. There are days where I'm overwhelmed, but I am really happy to be here today. So thank you for
Well,
having
I'm
me.
really
How about you?
happy you made time to be here to be a part of the hashtag Please Say Black vlog. As I learned how to vlog in the midst of multiple pandemics, but wanting to remind our subscribers and our viewers that telling Black stories, telling Black truths, and eliminating anti-Blackness is what we're here for. And so today we have Amber here who is going to illuminate so many possibilities for our minds to expand upon the concepts relating to Blackness and Indigenous cultures. And so I would love you, Amber, to use this time to tell us a little bit about yourself, because people can always do a better job talking about themselves than I can.
Sure. Hesche, Amber Chehotepkados, Ishti Muskogi Ome, Ishti Leshti Ome, Ishti Chadi Ome. I pretty much said in Muskogi, hi, my name is Amber. I am Muskogi. I'm also a Black person, and I'm also a Native person or an Indigenous person. And I identify as Afro-Indigenous, an African-American woman, and then also an Indigenous woman of Muskogi. Like, Muskogi people are my people. I recognize them, they recognize me. So I am an enrolled citizen. But I'm also of Shawnee, Yuchi, Quapaw, and Cherokee descent. And, I like to differentiate because one tribe I'm enrolled in, the others I'm not enrolled in, but these are my people, being that I descended from peoples of those groups. And I know those peoples by name and picture. And I never want to discount them as being like my ancestors, my predecessors, the people that I carry in my blood. So I think I like to say for these situations that I'm an activist, but really I feel like I'm trying to be in community with folks who are trying to do this real work of seeking like a Black liberated future, a sovereign Indigenous future where Indigenous peoples, not just here in the, what we say is the US, but globally, realize their sovereignty, and we working together can dismantle settler colonialism, white supremacy, and also predatory racial capitalism, because I think that they all are intersections that you can't speak to one without the other. Like these projects, these colonial projects, are rooted in white supremacy, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism. So I think a lot of the things that I'm working on and speaking to are about like Black and Native solidarity and working together. And I think just as an Afro-Indigenous woman, I can't resist those conversations, because I have to speak to both anti-Indigeneity and anti-Blackness in both communities and then just globally. So I'm pretty much just talking online, hoping people will be in conversation with me, learning from people, and just being open to the possibility that like I don't know everything, and I just want, like, I have hope for a future, because these projects are on their way out. Like, I believe that. And so we
Yes,
need to start doing
yes.
this work right now if we really want to have like a liberated future. So that's a mouthful, but that's kind of where I'm at. That's all the stuff that
Yeah.
I'm constantly
I was
navigating.
I was like, we done. This is the
Okay,
shortest
y'all, it's
episode
been real.
ever. Did it in 5 minutes. Okay. All right. We're
Woo.
gonna follow up with some of the things that you said earlier, but the first thing I want to do is kind of be just very transparent and also direct. And I'm gonna just say one word, and that one word is Thanksgiving.
Okay,
So
go. Okay.
we're
So,
recording a few days before Thanksgiving here in the United States. The Canadians have already done their giving of thanks.
mhm.
I would love to know your thoughts as both being someone who identifies with those amazing groups and communities.
So I have kind of an interesting relationship to Thanksgiving, in that like I grew up celebrating it. I think like just coming into my own identity around indigeneity, I think, even as a young child with my family, we weren't celebrating Thanksgiving as like the pilgrim. Like, that was never the thing. It was always rooted in family. And I think like in the Native community, this is a broad statement. You know, you're going to find people across the spectrum. There are folks who are celebrating it as like, we survived, right?
Yes.
This is us saying we're still here, no matter what has
Despite
happened.
the fact that so many people tried to make that erasure permanent.
Yes, it was a genocidal project, an intentional genocidal project. So I think that you will find Indigenous folks who are not celebrating Thanksgiving as, you know, the commercial idea of it, but more as like a celebration of survival. You will find folks who will say, I want nothing to do with that. We shouldn't even be calling it Thanksgiving. It still has consequences, right?
Yes.
And it still has like it brings up trauma, it brings up harm, and want nothing to do with it.
Which makes so much sense, right?
Does. And both ideas are valid. Both feelings and situation, like that's valid. And I feel like Indigenous people, you know, Black folks, people of color in general exist on a spectrum, and how we feel about things should be valid in the sense that we should be, our self-determination, our individual right to self-determination should be important, right? Like that's one of the things as, you know, marginalized people that often gets taken away from us, our right to choice, even if it's something that, you know, someone on the other end may disagree with. So, you know, for me, like my daughter, we've been kind of talking about Thanksgiving, and I will say, well, we're going to celebrate Native American Heritage Month. That day for me is celebrating a culmination, because November is Native American Heritage Month. So I've been trying to kind of reframe it as that for her. But it's hard when everybody else is saying Thanksgiving, when she's learning that at preschool. So I just inform her like, well, we're not really celebrating Thanksgiving that way. We're celebrating Native American Heritage Month, you know, on that day where we're going to get together with friends and family. And I'm celebrating our survival, not the day per se. So that's how I see, you know, Thanksgiving.
Well, thank you for giving us that very informed and thoughtful position. It was just one of those things that I was thinking, how powerful would it be to get your position on it as someone who is invested in the community and in the passion and in the longevity of Native and Indigenous folks. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
You are an enrolled member.
Yes.
Of the Mvskoke.
Yes, Creek Nation. Yes.
I feel like I should get $100.
Because you said it right.
Yes. I was like, okay, do it. Just try your best.
Creek Nation, that's right. High five.
So what does it mean? Yeah. What does it mean to be? And I'm not saying this like, because I need to check my tone. Because for a second I was gonna sound like one of those explorers as we go into the deep, deep jungles. Get a British accent real fast. We've located
a proper colonial accent.
We've located a native. So let me dial it back a little. What does it mean to be Black and Indigenous?
It means so much to me. Can I say that first? Like, I feel so proud to exist in this like duality, to exist in this like multidimensional being, you know, like I am, you know, as a kid, like I was enculturated as a Black woman, but always knowing that my dad used to say Creek, that I was Creek. But there was always, and I share this story a lot, so I'm sure if your viewers have seen me talk, maybe they've heard this, but you know, when I would say I was Native,
Okay, so we lost each other for a second.
Yes, it froze. I don't know how much you got of it.
So start with, my dad used to say we were Creek.
Okay. So my dad used to say we were Creek. And so I think I knew that, but I didn't know it, right? Like I had this idea of what that meant, but being separated geographically, being separated, you know, culturally, I feel like I just wasn't grounded in it. I wasn't sure of it. And so as a grown-ass woman who's been navigating this now, I have come to the point of like being assured in it, even though I'm still reconnecting. Like I identify as a reconnecting Native. And that means that I'm learning like a child from my relatives, and, you know, relatives being like non-blood relatives, people within my tribe who do know these things, who are pretty much helping me come home. So, you know, my
Mm-hmm.
tribe was one of the tribes that was forcibly removed and forced on the Trail of Tears from our ancestral homes in Alabama and Georgia, to now, you know, now what is called Alabama and Georgia, to Oklahoma. And so I kind of see my journey as like that walk back, like having to reclaim each step back. And so with each of those steps, you know, there's something required of me. And so I have a responsibility to that. I don't, you know, I can't just say I'm Muskogee without like doing that work. And
Yeah.
so you will never hear me really talk about being Muskogee other than like identifying, because I'm still learning what that means, and I'm not in a position to like tell people what that is. So respecting that. But I feel like there's this sense of pride in like holding these two identities, and there's a sense of responsibility too. There's like a knowing that, you know, on these platforms, like my Afro-Indigenous relatives, you know, and my Indigenous relatives and my African relatives didn't have these kind of positions to be able to speak bluntly and boldly about our oppression, about our subjugation, about our traumas. You know, like, you know, we talked about being able to go talk to someone and walk through our everything that was happening. Like, I have a privilege that I feel like I have a responsibility to. So I'm so proud, and I'm trying to do that justice. I'm trying to, you know, my ancestors are in my blood. So hopefully they are experiencing liberation as I'm experiencing it. You know, that's my hope.
Yeah, that's
That
so
I
good.
prepare a place for my grandchildren and my children, you know, to also actually have a realized, liberated future, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Um, I just that was so good. Like, amen. Like, you know, I'm just listening to you, right? And feeling this kind of guttural response, because if there's nothing else that I know, and I have limited knowledge of what it means to be an indigenous person, of course, I don't have any knowledge. Let's be clear.
Mhm.
Is both communities are so tribal and
Yes.
communal.
Yes.
And so what a powerful affect to have in life is, like you said, that sense of responsibility and accountability,
Yes.
that really has unfortunately been shaped by so much violence.
Yes. And so much trauma, and yeah, and I want to say that I do see Black folks as displaced Indigenous peoples of Africa, right? Like we were stolen, we were brought here not of our own desire or, you know, wants. And so Blackness is indigenous to lots of places in the world, to you know, lots of countries in Africa. Even like I'm learning a lot about Aboriginal peoples in Australia and their struggle with like anti-Blackness, because they've been racialized as Black. They're not necessarily of African descent, but even the same kind of like racial hierarchy exists there, you know, with whiteness as the top, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples also having to navigate that the same kind of stuff that we as Black folks, like being racialized, this construct of race has been like transported and franchised around the world, right? And
Yeah.
so we're not the only folks necessarily dealing with it. And I think, you know, so I'm trying to, in a lot of ways, think about these things globally, because white supremacy, set of colonialism, racial predatory capitalism, you'll probably hear me say that 20 times today, but are global projects, right?
Yes,
Like
they
these are
are.
these, and so I think I have a responsibility also to be listening to other Indigenous and Black folks around the world, and how they're navigating their liberation, how they're claiming their liberation, how they're um, dismantling these projects, because we can't just center ourselves as, you know, people in the US, like as these privileged, you know, people who have the answer. Like we should be listening to our, you know, our relatives around the world and watching what they're doing too.
Well, and that's why, I mean, there are so many different groups of people who are accounted for in the African diaspora,
Yes. Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And I mean, that's a whole different, that's a whole different episode. We're not going to
Yeah,
get
we might
into
have to
that.
have another to be continued, right?
Yeah, part two. But like this idea, and so, I mean, Black folks are hella intersectional and we're hella diverse.
Absolutely.
And so nobody else needs to come to the table. Not saying we don't, we're not saying you can't come to the table, but I'm just saying, when organizations and, people are asking, oh, we need a diverse audience. It's like, well, hell, just a group of Black folks in a room is diversity.
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Everybody within that group, right?
Right. There's not a place, there's not a continent, there's Afro-Latina. It's just so many different groups of people that we're embedded in. And it makes you wonder with the diaspora being what it is. And I'm so glad you talked about what's happening to our brothers and sisters in places like Australia, because Anti-Blackness is a global project.
Absolutely.
Why do we need to know that as Black folks?
That's a really good question.
Okay,
Dang.
look at me
I'm like, okay, let me let's let my wheels start. Why do we need to know that? Well, because I think it's in. Okay, go ahead.
I was about to contextualize that. Let's think about this differently, because I think we talked about this. So often people think, oh, what I'm experiencing is just racism, or what I'm experiencing is just prejudice. In some ways, I think sometimes people take the onus on them. Like,
yeah,
if I would just talk this way at work or wear my hair this way at work, then everything would be okay. So why do people need to know that Anti-Blackness is a global project?
There's intentionality behind it, right? This is not just a natural phenomena. This is intentional in that Black folks around the world were meant under these systems to be commodity, to be utility, to be transactional, right? Our humanity was never supposed to be realized. And we were supposed to go along with it. Like, even now, we're still supposed to go along with it. We are supposed to be okay with our subjugation. We are supposed to line up with these ideologies and accept them, right? Accept your enslavement. Like, this is your place. This is why we're going to teach you these things, is because you need to understand, like, there are times where Black folks were taught, God put you here. So you need to serve God. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there is intentionality behind these hierarchies, this caste system, right? There's that book recently. I haven't read it yet, but I haven't read it, but it's on my list. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Mine too. And I think that's what we have to understand, that it's meant to teach us our position when this is not our inheritance. This is not our natural state of being, And so if we don't understand that, we might just believe it. And that's the danger, is when we believe it, because then what happens? We line up. And we also, we stay silent, right? Just like a side note, and I'm going to grab us back, but like, even with the presidential election, and I keep hearing people talk about, President Trump is like recalling votes and, wanting to challenge the Democratic votes. And I'm like, let's call a thing a thing. Yeah, it is. He's coming for Black ballots. And he's coming for Black voters. Absolutely. People didn't start saying things like stop the vote until Philly came in. Yep. You get what I'm saying? Until Atlanta was coming in. You get what I'm saying? To Detroit. So you're okay with all the other shit that existed. Yes. I say the S word, but I'm just saying. And so when I'm hearing the reporting, I'm like, okay, ... But let's not forget, it's also the Black votes that he's attempting to disenfranchise. So that is another reason why we have to understand that Anti-Blackness is a global project, so that when we see it, we can identify it and say, oh no, this is what this is. Absolutely. So true. And I think, what is the comedian that kind of does the spoofs for the Trump spoofs? She said something that was, I'm going to paraphrase because I know. I think her name was Sarah, right? Yeah. Sarah. And she's, she pretty much said, let's call a spade a spade. He's trying to make Blackness illegal. Like, right? You're going through the legal system to make this illegal, because these are the only votes that have, like, threatened you, right? And that was those are the only unquestionable votes. Yes. And I think that was his worry to begin with, is that Black folks were going to show up. And Lord, they know how to vote. Native folks, because when we look at Arizona, Arizona flipped. But if you looked at the Democratic regions, those are where reservations are, right? So
Wow.
finding ways to delegitimize Blackness. Like, you weren't even meant to be able to vote in the first place. Therefore, let's not even count these votes.
You weren't even supposed to be a part of the We the People.
No, exactly. So I mean, that's just such a really brilliant question. Like, why should we even know this, right? That's fire.
I just want to kind of get us a landing strip, because we've talked so much, and I mean, there's a lot that you've given me and our listeners to think about. What are we feeling about, or let me ask more specifically, what are your thoughts on terms like POC, BIPOC? What are your thoughts on those things, those terminology?
So again, I'm not an absolutist. I understand. I did an interview about this a little bit ago, and that question, that was the whole episode. Like, let's talk about this. So I think what I've been learning about like POC and BIPOC, these are terms that have come out of our communities. These weren't white folks inventing it, right? So these terms became ways that we saw each other. But unfortunately, even within that, there's lateral violence, right? There's lateral oppression. And so I think BIPOC evolved out of POC as a way to say, we need to make sure we understand there's a hierarchy even within people of color, and that oftentimes Black folks and Indigenous folks are erased. And so by adding the B and the I, we're saying, I see you, I acknowledge you, right? I know that it's still problematic in a lot of ways for folks, because then we don't say what we mean, right? And so this is part of like what you're doing, is like, say Black when you mean Black, say Indigenous when you mean Indigenous. But I do want to honor the fact that this is language that Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian folks, that we're coming up with to decenter whiteness. So instead of saying non-white folks, right? Because that's what we used to say, non-white folks.
I was say that's what I say now. What are you talking about?
Yeah, like, right. And so for me, in saying that, I almost feel like we still center whiteness, right? We're putting white first. So in a lot of ways, saying people of color, we're calling who we are out, and then BIPOC is an extension of that. So I want to say that as people of color, as BIPOC, we have the right
all the things
to play with that language, right? We have the right to try to figure out what works best for us, and that when we're speaking to one another, hopefully we're not carrying those hierarchies over from white supremacy, but any ways that we're trying to like speak to one another, I think is a form of liberation. Like, we're trying to step towards some form of liberation outside of like white supremacy. So yeah, they can be problematic. But I don't think we have to get things right the first time, right? Like, that's around like our ability to be self-determinate, is to like navigate language, because language evolves, right? Like our parents and grandparents used to say Negro, and like these words that I don't identify as a Negro, but I understand that was a self-determinate word for the generations before us. And I would never want to I would never want to dishonor them by saying you're not Negro, if that's what my grandmother's going to call. Like, so my grandmother, I ask her how she identifies, and she says, I'm an Indian. Folks in my generation, we don't say Indian, we say Indigenous or Native, or we say our tribe, right? But for my grandma, she's like, I'm Indian, and that's like a badge of honor. And so I think that, again, language evolves. How we as, persons of color, non-white persons of BIPOC, how we're navigating that language, I think we need to give each other grace. And I think we need to be okay with our language evolving. And if someone's using that term as a way to reclaim their, identity, or reclaim their sense of like liberation, I'm for them. Like I'm so down for self-determination and autonomy of like Black people, Black bodies, and Indigenous bodies, and marginalized bodies, right? So like any answer to this question, I think is complicated, and that's okay.
It's totally okay, especially because we're expecting language that we were never supposed to speak to hold us. And so
Absolutely.
there's always going to be limitations.
That is so perfect in that. Like, I think I tweeted something or Instagram something about that. Like, the language of the oppressor can never fully explain who we really are. It could
Yep.
never. There's so many limitations to it being able to describe us because its intent was to subjugate us, to harm
Yeah.
us, to oppress us. And so I don't necessarily think we have to rely on it to like completely describe who we are or, what our worth is, what we're worthy of.
Yeah. Last thing.
Okay.
What do you want us to know? What lessons can we learn from following your project, for learning more about our Indigenous roots? I unfortunately don't have them. I did my ancestry a couple of years ago. I'm hella African.
Yay. That's a good thing.
Girl,
I want people to be.
93%, 93%. I look, if you Black in the United States, I suggest you figure it out, because when reparations come, they not just gonna let y'all get in line. I always tell folks, you're gonna have to have some documentation.
Yeah,
But
this is
seriously,
what
like,
I follow on Instagram, or I think on Twitter, and her hat or her tag is Black with mixed with Black, and I am so for it. Like, she's not trying to be nothing else but Black, and I think that is so powerful.
now the other 7% is some stuff, you know.
Who you telling?
You know, but
okay,
but
so yeah,
what lessons can be learned? What lessons can we learn? Rather, because I learned a lot from you, and I'm not Indigenous. I don't identify as Indigenous, but I'm learning to love and expand my mind, because I have Black brothers and sisters who are. So, what lessons can be learned?
Man, do we have another hour? Okay, so some of the first things that came to mind when you asked me that. First, Blackness is sufficient. There is your Blackness, how it is, expressed, displayed, ornamented, whatever. I don't even know the right word. That's sufficient. That's good enough. Blackness is not a monolith. And you deserve to be self-determinate. So like that is really important to me when it comes to like Black folks and our Blackness. I want people to know that Indigenous people still exist and that this is Indigenous land. There are over 500 tribes, federally recognized, state recognized, not recognized, who have survived a genocidal project on our ancestral lands, where our ancestors since time immemorial are buried. The trees carry our ancestors, like we are still here. And I think it's important to understand that indigeneity is not a monolith, right? There are Black natives, there are white natives, there are Asian natives. There's, inside indigeneity, there's also a spectrum. I want us to understand that we've all learned white supremacy. We've all learned settler colonialism. And in that, even as oppressed people, sometimes we can be violent and traumatic towards one another. And we're competing, I think sometimes to be heard, but oftentimes it's for the white gaze, for the white acceptance, for, white supremacy. And I want us to be mindful of that. We have a mutual oppressor. Like if we're so focused on one another and who's getting, more, whatever, we're forgetting that like our subjugation, our oppression is not one another. Like we're not doing it. We don't have the power to really do that to one another. And I think that if we take our eyes off of what the real problem is, we're gonna stay stuck in where we are, right? We're not gonna have the ability, we're gonna stay stuck in our trauma. We're gonna see each other as our means of trauma. And we're not gonna realize that there's context to our trauma. Like two things that I hear often, on my platform. One, well, Native folks own slaves. And two, the Buffalo Soldiers are the ones who caused us harm. But if we don't realize the context of those, how the settler state bribed and forced and even used, natives who were the first generation of white and native to enrich them financially with land and all those things as a means of using to enslave Black folks, because they saw the threat between Black and Indigenous folks. Like if we got together and we realized what was really happening, we would have a threat to this system. And so my hope is that, learn like being like contextualizing these arguments of trauma, of lateral violence, against one another. If we don't do that, we're going to miss a whole bunch. The other thing with the Buffalo Soldiers is a lot of folks don't realize like these were soldiers who fought in the Civil War, like newly freed slaves, right? Enslaved folks who then the colonial state used to go and forcibly remove Native folks in the Southwest off their land. So those Native folks, their first contact with the settler state were Black men, right? And think about how intentional that was, right? And so then you have these generations of folks who are like anti-Black because of the harm and the trauma they experienced.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really important that we contextualize our oppression, especially when we're thinking about one another in lateral violence. So that's important to me. So yeah, Blackness is sufficient. Indigenous people still exist, and this still is an Indigenous land. And let's contextualize our trauma, and let's realize that we have a mutual oppressor, and that if we're going to be talking about Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, we need to include one another in that, right? When Black folks say Black Lives Matter, Indigenous folks shouldn't say, well, what about Indigenous lives? We should say, yes, I see you. How can I help? When Indigenous people say, hey, like our women are being murdered and raped, and excuse me, I didn't give anybody a trigger warning, but when there's sexual assault happening on the reservation and the U.S. government isn't doing anything, we as Black folks need to say, I see you, how can we help, right? Like, this is how we should be responding to one another versus like seeing each other as competition. Competition for what is what we should be asking ourselves. What competition are we trying to, like, why are we trying to one up one another,
Yeah, to maintain racial hierarchy.
Yes, to maintain this construct that has not been for either one of our benefits. It still reinforces white supremacy. And this is, if we're seeking a liberated future, an authentic liberated future, if we're seeking an authentic sovereign Indigenous, state or state of being, then we are going to have to work to, like, this project had us in mind, like both of our peoples in mind, for destruction and utility, for commodity, and all those things. And we have to contextualize our struggles. We have to contextualize our fights for liberation. And if we don't, I think we're missing a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, Amber, thank you so much. I just want you to tell the people who view this how they can find you, how they can connect, how they can learn more.
So when I'm not hiding, you can find me on, I do mostly work on Instagram, and I almost use Twitter to like tweet and then put on Instagram. So I'm at Instagram or Twitter at Melanin Mvskoke, and Mvskoke is spelled the way we spell it in my language. So MVSKOKE. So Melanin Mvskoke, you'll find me on one of those. And I want to apologize because I know my DMs are full, but I just cannot keep up. So if you send me a message, it may take me a couple months, and it's about self-care. It's about I cannot. It's a lot.
You Black and liberated, and you got people following you out here in these streets. It's okay, girl. This was a pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Likewise. And I so appreciate you. I feel like just this conversation and our little conversation before, man, like I feel a sense of liberation just in that, like in our little conversation. So I just want to say I appreciate you. And like, yes, thank you for having me.
All right. Well, we'll talk soon.
Okay.